Life goes on, yes, and a fool and his self-respect are soon parted, perhaps never to be reunited even on Judgment Day. Pay attention, please, for years, as well as people, are characters in this book, which is the story of my life so far. 1946 gave me a wife. 1946 gave me an ungrateful son. 1953 fired me from the federal government. 1970 gave me a job in the Nixon White House. 1975 sent me to prison for my own preposterous contributions to the American political scandals known collectively as Watergate. 3 years ago, as I write, 1977 was about to turn me loose again. I felt like a piece of garbage. I stared straight ahead at a wall on the second floor of a barracks at the Federal Minimum Security Adult Correctional Facility on the edge of Finletter Air Force Base, 35 miles from Atlanta, Georgia. I was waiting for a guard to conduct me to the administration building, where I would be given my release papers and my civilian clothes. It was 9 in the morning on April 21st. The guard was 1 hour late. A fighter plane leaped up from the top of a nearby runway, destroyed enough energy to heat 100 homes for 1,000 years, tore the sky to shreds. I did not bat an eyelash. The event was merely tedious to old prisoners and guards at Finletter. Was I shown no special respect in prison as a Harvard man? It was no distinction, actually. I had met or heard of at least 7 others, and no sooner would I leave than my cot would be taken by Virgil Greathouse, former Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, who was also a Harvard man. I was quite low on the educational ladder at Finletter, with nothing but a poor bachelor's degree in the liberal arts, with some emphasis on history and economics. It was my plan when I entered Harvard to become a public servant, an employee rather than an elected official. I believed that there could be no higher calling in a democracy than to a lifetime in government. And now I speak of my plans and my beliefs. But being so new to the planet in those days, I had been glad to adopt as my own the plans and beliefs of a much older man. He was a Cleveland multimillionaire named Alexander Hamilton McCone, a member of the Harvard class of 1894. He was the reclusive, stammering son of Daniel McCone, a brilliant and brutal Scottish engineer and metallurgist who founded the Cuyahoga Bridge and Iron Company, the largest single employer in Cleveland when I was born. Imagine being born as long ago as 1913. Alexander Hamilton McCone was 41 years old when I was born into his mansion on Euclid Avenue. And what was I to Mr. McCone that I should have been born into the unhappy stillness of his mansion? My mother, born Anna Keris in Russian Lithuania, was his cook. My father, born Stanislav Stankiewicz in Russian Poland, was his bodyguard and chauffeur. Very early on, Mr. McCone began to tell me and my parents that I was a genius, which I surely was not, and that he would send me to Harvard. To that end, and when I was about 10 years old, he had us change our family name from Stankiewicz to Starbuck. I would be better received at Harvard, he said, if I had an Anglo-Saxon name. Thus did Walter F. Starbuck become my name. So there I sat in prison in 1977, waiting for the guard to come. The guard's name was Clyde Carter. He was one of the few friends I had made in prison. Our chief bond was that we had taken the same correspondence course in bartending from a diploma mill in Chicago, the Illinois Institute of Instruction, a division of the Ramjack Corporation. On the same day and in the same mail, each of us had received his Doctor of Mixology degree. Clyde surpassed me by taking the school's course in air conditioning as well. Clyde was a third cousin to the President of the United States, Jimmy Carter. He was about 5 years younger than the President, but was otherwise his perfect spit and image. He had the same nice manners, the same bright smile. A degree in bartending was enough for me. That was all I intended to do with the rest of my life. Tend a quiet bar somewhere, ideally in a club for gentlemen. I thought now about Sacco and Vanzetti. When I was young, I believed that the story of their martyrdom would cause an irresistible mania for justice to the common people to spread throughout the world. Does anybody know or care who they were anymore? No. I thought about the Cuyahoga Massacre, which was the bloodiest single encounter between strikers and an employer in the history of American labor. It happened in Cleveland, in front of the main gate of the Cuyahoga Bridge and Iron Company, on Christmas morning in 1894. The man who had sent me to Harvard, Alexander Hamilton McCone, watched it from the factory clock tower in the company of his father and his older brother John. That was when he ceased to be a slight stammerer, and became, when the least bit anxious about anything, a bubbling booby of totally blocked language instead. Cuyahoga Bridge and Iron, incidentally, lost its identity, save in labor history, long ago. It was absorbed by Youngstown Steel shortly after the Second World War, and Youngstown Steel itself has now become a mere division of the Ramjack Corporation. Peace. My official title in the Nixon White House, the job I was holding when I was arrested for embezzlement, perjury, and obstruction of justice, was this: the President's Special Advisor on Youth Affairs. I had an office, but no secretary, in the sub-basement of the Executive Office Building, directly underneath the office where burglaries and other crimes on behalf of President Nixon were planned. Yes, and I read college and high school newspapers and magazines, and Rolling Stone and Crawdaddy and anything else that claimed to speak for youth. I catalogued political statements in the words of popular songs. My chief qualification for the job, I thought, was that I myself had been a radical at Harvard, starting in my junior year. I was, in fact, openly and proudly a card-carrying communist until Hitler and Stalin signed a non-aggression pact in 1939. Hell and heaven, as I saw it, were making common cause against weakly defended peoples everywhere. After that, I became a cautious believer in capitalist democracy again. It was once so acceptable in this country to be a communist that my being one did not prevent my winning a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford after Harvard, and then landing a job in Roosevelt's Department of Agriculture after that. What could be so repulsive, after all, during the Great Depression, especially, and with yet another war for natural wealths and markets coming, in a young man's belief that each person could work as well as he or she was able and should be rewarded, sick or well, young or old, brave or frightened, talented or imbecilic, according to his or her simple needs. And even now, at the rueful age of 66, I find my knees still turn to water when I encounter anyone who still considers it a possibility that there will one day be one big, happy, peaceful family on earth, the family of man. So my idealism did not die even in the Nixon White House, did not die even in prison, did not die even when I became, my most recent employment, a vice president of the Down Home Records Division of the Ramjack Corporation. When I was Richard M. Nixon's Special Advisor on Youth Affairs from 1970 until my arrest in 1975, nobody ever asked me for facts or opinions or anything. I need not even have come to work. Knowing full well that everything I wrote would be shredded and baled with all the rest of the White House waste paper unread, I still turned out some 200 or more weekly reports on the sayings and doings of youth. But the conclusions implied by my materials changed so little over the years that I might as well have simply sent the same telegram each week to Limbo. It would have said this: young people still refuse to see the obvious impossibility of world disarmament and economic equality. Could be fault of New Testament. Walter F. Starbuck, President's Special Advisor on Youth Affairs. At the end of every futile day in the sub-basement, I would go home to the only wife I have ever had, who was Ruth, waiting for me in our little brick bungalow in Chevy Chase, Maryland. She was Jewish, which I am not. So our only child, a son who is now a book reviewer for the New York Times, is half Jewish. He has further confused racial and religious matters by marrying a black nightclub singer who has 2 children by a former husband. The former husband was a nightclub comedian of Puerto Rican extraction named Jerry Cha-Cha Rivera, who was shot as an innocent bystander during the robbery of a ramjacked car wash in Hollywood. My son has adopted the children, so that they are legally my grandchildren. My only grandchildren. Life goes on. My late wife, Ruth, was born in Vienna. Her family owned a rare bookstore there, before the Nazis took it away from them. She was 6 years younger than I. Her father and mother and 2 siblings were killed in concentration camps. She herself was in a concentration camp near Munich, finally liberated by American troops for the last 2 years of the war. She herself would die in her sleep in 1974 of congestive heart failure, 2 weeks before my own arrest. Whither I went, and no matter how clumsily, there did my Ruth go, as long as she could. She might have been a famous photographer. When she was only 16, 3 years before Germany annexed Austria, she photographed 100 beggars in Vienna, all of whom were terribly wounded veterans of World War I. These were sold in portfolios, one of which I have found recently in the collection of New York's Museum of Modern Art. I was Ruth's inferior, you might say. When things started to go really badly for me in the 50s and 60s, when I was unable to get a decent job anywhere, she became an interior decorator, beguiling prospective clients with watercolors of rooms she would like to do for them, and I was her clumsy assistant, hanging draperies, holding wallpaper samples against a wall, taking telephone messages from clients, and on and on. I set fire to $1,100 worth of blue velvet draperies one time. No wonder my son never respected me. When did he ever have a chance to? My God, there his mother was, trying to support the family and scrimping and saving to get by, and there his unemployed father was, always in the way and helpless, and finally setting fire to a fortune in draperies with a cigarette. Hooray for Harvard education! Oh, to be the proud son of a Harvard man. Ruth was a tiny woman, incidentally, with coppery skin and straight black hair and high cheekbones and deep-set eyes. The first time I laid eyes on her, which was in Nuremberg, Germany, in late August of 1945, she was wearing voluminous army fatigues, and I mistook her for a gypsy boy. I was a civilian employee of the Defense Department, 32 years old. I'd been sent over to oversee the feeding and housing of the American, British, French, and Russian delegations to the war crimes trials. Near St. Martha's Church on the Königstrasse, my Mercedes was halted at a security checkpoint. Ruth was then 26 years old, but she had eaten so badly for 7 years, mostly potatoes and turnips, that she was an asexual stick. She herself, it turned out, had come to the roadblock only an hour before I had, and had been pressed into service by the MPs because of all the languages she knew. I coaxed her into the back seat of my Mercedes, and I questioned her there. I learned that she'd been freed from a concentration camp in springtime about 4 months before. She was uninterested in ever trusting anybody with her destiny any more. "No one ever touches me," she said, "and I never touch anyone. I am like a bird in flight. It is so beautiful. There is only God and me." I thought this of her, that she resembled gentle Ophelia in Hamlet, who became fey and lyrical when life was too cruel to bear. Ruth, one of millions of Europe's Ophelias after the Second World War, fainted in my motor car. I took her to a 20-bed hospital that was being set up exclusively for persons associated with the war crimes trials. It was vitamins and minerals and protein and, of course, tender, loving care that made all the difference to Ruth. After only 3 weeks in the hospital, she was a sane and witty Viennese intellectual. I hired her as my personal interpreter and took her everywhere with me. I began to speak to Ruth of love almost as soon as she got out of the hospital. Her replies were kind of funny and perceptive, but above all, pessimistic. "How can you speak of love to a woman," she asked me early in our courtship, "who feels that it would be just as well if nobody had babies anymore, if the human race did not go on?" "Never mind babies," I said. "Think of the new era that is being born. The world has learned its lesson at last. At last! The closing chapter to 10,000 years of madness and greed is being written right here and now, in Nuremberg. It's the most important turning point in history." I believed it. "Walter," she said, "sometimes I think you are only 8 years old." "It's the only age to be," I said, "when a new era is being born." Clocks struck 6 all over town. "Well," said Ruth, when the sounds of the bells had died away, "when you 8-year-olds kill evil here in Nuremberg, be sure to bury it at a crossroads and drive a stake through its heart, or you just might see it again at the next full moon." A door in the prison dormitory below me opened and banged shut, and I supposed that Clyde Carter had come for me at last. But then the person began to sing "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot" as he clumped up the stairway, and I knew he was Emil Larkin, once President Nixon's hatchet man. He was a disbarred lawyer now, and he prayed all day long to what he believed to be Jesus Christ. Larkin had not been sent out on any work detail or assigned any housekeeping task, incidentally, because of what all his praying on hard prison floors had done to him. He was crippled in both legs with housemaid's knee. He paused at the top of the stairs, and there were tears in his eyes. "Oh, Brother Starbuck," he said, "it hurts so bad, and it hurts so good to climb those stairs." "I'm not surprised," I said. "Jesus said to me," he went on, "you have one last chance to ask Brother Starbuck to pray with you, and you've got to forget the pain it will cost you to climb those stairs, because you know what? This time, Brother Starbuck is going to bend those proud Harvard knees, and he's going to pray with you." "I'd hate to disappoint him," I said. "Have you ever done anything else?" he said. "That's all I used to do, disappoint Jesus every day." "Who told you where I was?" I asked him. I was sorry he'd found me. "Clyde Carter," he said. "Where the heck is he?" I said. Larkin said that the whole administration of the prison was in an uproar because Virgil Greathouse, the former Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, and one of the richest men in the country, had suddenly decided to begin serving his sentence immediately. I knew Greathouse mainly by sight and, of course, by reputation. He was a famous tough guy, the founder and still majority stockholder in the public relations firm of Greathouse and Smiley, which specialized in putting the most favorable interpretations on the activities of Caribbean and Latin American dictatorships, of several Central Intelligence Agency fronts around the world, of gangster-dominated unions, of international conglomerates such as Ramjack and Texas Fruit, and on and on. Emil Larkin and Virgil Greathouse had been thick as thieves back in the good old days. So I asked Larkin now how he felt about the reunion in prospect. "Virgil Greathouse is no more and no less my brother than you or any other man," he said. "I will try to save him from hell just as I'm now trying to save you from hell." He then quoted the harrowing thing that Jesus, according to St. Matthew, had promised to say in the person of God to sinners on Judgment Day. This is it. "Depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire, prepared for the devil and his angels." These words appalled me then, and they appall me now. They are surely the inspiration for the notorious cruelty of Christians. Jesus may have said that, I told Larkin, but it is so unlike most of what else he said that I have to conclude that he was slightly crazy that day. Larkin stepped back and cocked his head in mock admiration. "I've seen some rough, tough babies in my time," he said, "but you really take the prize. You've turned every friend you ever had against you with all your flip-flops through the years, and now you insult that last person who might still be willing to help you, who is Jesus Christ. Name me one friend you've got left," he said. "Bob Fender," I said. This was the only lifer in the prison, the only American to have been convicted of treason during the Korean War. He was Dr. Fender since he held a degree in veterinary science. He was the chief clerk in the supply room where I would soon be given my civilian clothes. He was a science fiction writer of some note, publishing many stories a year under various pseudonyms, including Frank X. Barlow and Kilgore Trout. "Clyde Carter's, my friend," I said. "I am talking about people on the outside," said Larkin. "Who's waiting outside to help you? Nobody. Not even your own son." "We'll see," I said. "You're going to New York?" he said. "Yes," I said. "You're going to ask your son for help, even though he's never even written to you the whole time you've been here?" he said. He was the mail clerk for my building, so he knew all about my mail. "If he ever finds out I'm in the same city with him, it'll be purely by accident," I said. The last words Walter had ever said to me were at his mother's burial in a small Jewish cemetery in Chevy Chase. "I pity you, but I can never love you. As far as I'm concerned, you killed this poor woman. I can't think of you any more as a father or as any sort of relative. I never want to see or hear of you again." Strong stuff. "Well," said Larkin, "Jesus tells me not to give up on anybody, but I'm close to giving up on you. I never saw anybody more determined to be a geek than you are." A geek, of course, is a man who lies in a cage on a bed of filthy straw in a carnival freak show and bites the heads off live chickens and makes subhuman noises. "Do you know exactly when you started to be a geek?" he said. I knew exactly when the downward dive of my life began, when I realized that I would never soar again. That event was the most painful subject imaginable to me. I could not bear to think about it again, so I said to Larkin, looking him in the eye at last, "In the name of mercy, please leave this poor man alone." He was elated. "I touched a nerve, didn't I?" "You touched a nerve," I said. "I was just a little boy in knee pants in Petoskey, Michigan, when I first heard your voice," he said. "It was on the radio." The year would have been 1949. Where was my voice coming from that it should have been heard by little Emil Larkin in Petoskey? From a committee room in the House of Representatives with a brutal bouquet of radio microphones before me, I was being questioned principally by a young congressman from California named Richard M. Nixon about my previous associations with communists and about my present loyalty to the United States. "You know what I heard on that radio?" said Emil Larkin. "No," I said, ever so emptily. "I heard a man betray his best friend." "Leland Clues was never my best friend," I said. This was the name of the man who was ruined by my testimony. Clues was a Yale man, my age. We first met at Oxford, where I was the coxswain and he was the bowman of a winning crew at Henley. I was short, he was tall. I am still short. He is still tall. We went to work for the Department of Agriculture at the same time, and were assigned adjacent cubicles. We played tennis every Sunday morning. But my friendship with Clues was never deep, and it ended when he took a girl away from me and married her. She was one of the 4 women I have ever truly loved. Sarah Wyatt was her maiden name. When I accidentally ruined him, Leland Clues had become the brightest meteor in the State Department, and it was widely conceded that he would be Secretary of State someday, and maybe even President. I ruined him in this way. Under oath, and in reply to a question by Congressman Nixon, I named a number of men who were known to have been communists during the Great Depression, but who had proved themselves to be outstanding patriots during World War II. On that roll of honor I included the name of Leland Clues. No particular comment was made about this at the time. It was only when I got home late that afternoon that I learned from my wife, who had been listening to me and then to every news program she could find on the radio, that Leland Clues had never been connected with communism in any way before. And by the time Ruth put on supper, the radio was able to give us Leland Clues' reply. He wished to appear before Congress at the earliest opportunity in order to swear under oath that he had never been a communist, had never sympathized with any communist cause. 2 horrible years later, Leland Clues was convicted on 6 counts of perjury. He became one of the first prisoners to serve his sentence in the then-new federal minimum security adult correctional facility on the edge of Finletter Air Force Base, 35 miles from Atlanta, Georgia. Small world. Almost 20 years later, Richard M. Nixon, having become President of the United States, would suddenly wonder what had become of me. He would almost certainly never have become president, of course, if he had not become a national figure as the discoverer and hounder of the mendacious Leland Clues. His emissaries would find me, as I say, helping my wife with her decorating business. Through them, he would offer me a job. And now Clyde Carter, the prison guard I'd been waiting for so long on my cot, came to get me at last. Emil Larkin had by then given up on me and limped away. "I'm sorry, Walter," said Clyde. "Perfectly all right," I told him. "I'm in no hurry to go anywhere, and there are buses every 30 minutes. "Well, now listen," said Clyde. "When you get yourself a bartending job up there in New York, I just know you're going to wind up owning that bar inside of 2 years' time." This was kindness on his part and not genuine optimism. Clyde was trying to help me be brave. "And after you got the most popular bar in New York," he went on, "I just hope you'll remember Clyde and maybe send for him. I can not only tend bar, I can also fix your air conditioning." The prison was a hollow square of conventional 2-story military barracks. Clyde and I were crossing the vast parade ground at its center. We were hearing music now. We were nearing the supply room, and it was coming from a phonograph in there. Edith Piaf was singing "Non, je ne regrette rien." This means, of course, "No, I am not sorry about anything." The song ended just as Clyde and I entered the supply room so that Dr. Robert Fender, the supply clerk and lifer, could tell us passionately how much he agreed with the song. "No," he said, his teeth gnashing, his eyes blazing. "Je ne regrette rien. Rien." This was a veterinarian and the only American to have been convicted of treason during the Korean War. This American traitor bore a strong resemblance to a great American hero, Charles Augustus Lindbergh. He was tall and big-boned. He was a farm boy. He had actually been almost nowhere outside of prison but Ames, Iowa, and Osaka, Japan. He was so shy with women, he told me one time, that he was still a virgin when he reached Osaka, and then he fell crashingly in love with a female nightclub singer who passed herself off as Japanese and sang word-for-word imitations of Edith Piaf records. She was also a spy for North Korea. "My dear friend, my dear Walter Starbuck," he said. Now he was holding up the pants of my civilian suit, a gray, pinstripe Brooks Brothers suit for me to see. He asked me if I remembered the large cigarette hole there had been in the crotch. "Yes," I said. "Find it," he said. I could not. Nor could I find any other holes in the suit. At his own expense, he had sent the suit to an invisible mender in Atlanta. "That, dear Walter," he said, "is my going-away present to you." Almost everybody I knew got a going-away present from Fender. But the mending of my suit was by far the most personal and thoughtful one I'd ever heard of. I choked up. I could have cried. I told him so. Before he could make a reply, there were shouts and the thunder of scampering feet in offices in the front of the building, offices whose windows faced the 4-lane divided highway outside. It was believed that Virgil Greathouse, the former Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, had arrived out front. It was a false alarm. Clyde Carter and Dr. Fender ran out into the reception area so that they could see, too. So I was all alone in that supply room. I was grateful for the accident of privacy. I took advantage of it. I performed what was perhaps the most obscenely intimate physical act of my life. I gave birth to a broken, querulous little old man by doing this. by putting on my civilian clothes. When Clyde Carter and Dr. Fender returned to the supply room, I was a civilian again. Fender pretended to be my valet in an embassy somewhere. "Good morning, Mr. Ambassador. The Queen is expecting you for lunch at 1. Clyde said that it sure was easy to spot a Harvard man, that they all had that certain something. Here is who I saw reflected in the mirror. A scrawny old janitor of Slavic extraction. He was unused to wearing a suit and tie, his shirt collar much too large for him, and so was his suit, which fit him like a circus tent. He looked unhappy, on his way to a relative's funeral, perhaps. At no point was there any harmony between himself and the suit. He may have found his clothes in a rich man's ash can. Peace. I sat now on an unsheltered park bench by the highway in front of the prison. I was waiting for the bus. I was all alone. The bus was late. A great Cadillac limousine with pale blue curtains drawn across its back windows simmered by slowly on the other side of the median divider and continued on until it found a crossover about a quarter of a mile up. Then it came back down and stopped with its glossy front fender inches from my nose. The chauffeur got out and opened the back door. "Gentlemen, we have reached our destination." Letters embroidered in red silk thread on his breast pocket identified his employer. "Ramjack," they said. Out clambered Virgil Greathouse, dressed almost exactly as I was, in a gray pinstripe suit and a white shirt and a regimental striped tie. And then 2 sleek lawyers got out. Clyde Carter, the spit and image of President Carter, came out of the front door a few steps and motioned to them. "Y'all come in." So in they went, with their chauffeur bringing up the rear, carrying 2 valises made of buttery leather. Clyde relieved him of the bags at the threshold, told him politely to return to the limousine. "You won't be needed in there," said Clyde. So the chauffeur got back into the limousine. His name was Cleveland Laws, a garbling of the name of the man I had ruined, Leland Clues. He had only a grammar school education, but he read 5 books a week while waiting for people, mostly ramjack executives and customers and suppliers. And if Cleveland Laws had not offered me a ride into Atlanta, he would never have become what he is today, personnel director of the Transico division of the Ramjack Corporation. I asked him if he thought his passengers would mind my coming along to Atlanta. He said that he had never seen them before, and that he'd never expected to see them again, that they did not work for Ramjack. I asked him if he'd ever seen the legendary Mrs. Jack Graham, Jr., the majority stockholder in the Ramjack Corporation. "That's like asking me if I seen God," he said. The widow Graham had not been seen in public at that point for about 5 years. Her most recent appearance was in a courtroom in New York City, where Ramjack was being sued by a group of its stockholders for proofs that she was still alive. Mrs. Graham came into the courtroom without a lawyer, but with 8 uniformed bodyguards from Pinkerton, Inc., a Ramjack subsidiary. One of them was carrying an amplifier with a loudspeaker and a microphone. Mrs. Graham was wearing a voluminous black caftan with its hood up, and with a hood pinned shut with diaper pins so that she could peek out, but nobody could see what was inside. Only her hands were visible. Another Pinkerton was carrying an ink pad, some paper, and a copy of her fingerprints from the file of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Her prints had been forwarded to the FBI after she was convicted of drunken driving in 1952, soon after her husband died. The amplifier was turned on, and the microphone was slipped inside her caftan, so people could hear what she was saying in there. She proved she was who she said she was by fingerprinting herself on the spot. She said under oath that she was in excellent health, both physically and mentally, and in control of the company's top officers, but never face-to-face. When she instructed them on the telephone, she used a password to identify herself. Every order she gave on the phone was subsequently confirmed by mail, by a letter written entirely by her own hand. At the bottom of each letter was not only her signature, but a full set of prints from, as she called them, my 8 little fingers and my 2 little thumbs. That was that. Mrs. Jack Graham was unquestionably alive, and now she was free to disappear again. "I've seen Mr. Lean many times," said Cleveland Laws. He was speaking of Arpad Lean, the very public and communicative president and chairman of the board of directors of the Ramjack Corporation. He had come to Atlanta and been Law's passenger only 2 months before. A cluster of new stores and luxury hotels in Atlanta had gone bankrupt, and Lean had tried to snap it all up for Ramjack. He had been outbid, however, by a South Korean religious cult. The 2 lawyers got into the back seat of the limousine. They weren't subdued at all. They were laughing about the guard who looked like the President of the United States. So off we went to Atlanta. The planes to New York City were all overbooked, it turned out. I did not get out of Atlanta until 5 o'clock that afternoon. Two and a half hours later, I was on the island of Manhattan, wearing my trench coat to keep out the evening chill. The sun was down. I was staring at an animated display in the window of a store that sold nothing but toy trains. It was not as though I had no place to go. I was close to where I was going. I had written ahead. I had reserved a room without bath or television for a week, paying in advance, in the once fashionable Hotel Arapahoe, now a catch-as-catch-can lazarette in Banyo, 1 minute from Times Square. I had been to the Arapahoe once before, in the autumn of 1931. I was a Harvard freshman. I was operating under instructions from my mentor, Alexander Hamilton McCone. He told me in a letter that I was to duplicate a folly he himself had committed when a freshman, which was to take a pretty girl to the Harvard-Columbia football game in New York, and then to spend a month's allowance on a lobster dinner for 2, with oysters and caviar and all that, in the famous dining room of the Hotel Arapahoe. We were to go dancing afterward. "You must wear your tuxedo," he said. "You must tip like a drunken sailor." The girl I took there would become one of the 4 women I would ever truly love. The first was my mother. The last was my wife. Sarah Wyatt was the girl's name. She was all of 18, and so was I. She was attending a very easy 2-year college for rich girls in Wellesley, Massachusetts, which was Pine Manor. While we were in New York City together, she would be staying with her maternal grandmother, a stockbroker's widow, in a queerly irrelevant enclave of dead-end streets and vest-pocket parks and Elizabethan apartment hotels called Tudor City, near the East River. As luck will have it, my son now lives in Tudor City. So do Mr. and Mrs. Leland Clues. Small world. She wasn't quite ready when I arrived, so I had to talk to her grandmother, Mrs. Sutton, for a while. "It's a nice place you have here, Mrs. Sutton," I said. "You're the only person who thinks so," she said. "It's crowded. Everything that goes on in the kitchen you can smell out here." It was only a 2-bedroom apartment. She had certainly come down in the world. Sarah said she used to have a horse farm in Connecticut and a house on 5th Avenue. "Tell me again how you are related to the McCones," she said. I had never told anyone that I was related to the McCones. There was another lie I had told frequently, however, a lie, like everything else about me, devised by Mr. McCone. And I told it to Mrs. Sutton. "My father works for Mr. McCone as curator of his art collection. He also advises Mr. McCone on what to buy." "A cultivated man," she said. "He studied art in Europe," I said. "He's no businessman." "A dreamer," she said. "Yes," I said. "If it weren't for Mr. McCone, I could not afford to go to Harvard." "Starbuck," she mused.
I believe that's an old Nantucket name."
I was ready for that one, too. "Yes," I said, "but my great-grandfather left Nantucket for the gold rush and never returned."
"A California family," she said.
"Nomads, really," I said. "California, yes, but Oregon, too, and Wyoming, and Canada, and Europe. But they were always bookish people, teachers, and so on."
"Descended from whaling captains," she said.
"I imagine," I said. I was not at all uncomfortable with the lies.
"And from Vikings before that," she said.
I shrugged. She had decided to like me a lot, and would continue to do so until the end. As Sarah would tell me, Mrs. Sutton often referred to me as her little Viking. She would not live long enough to see Sarah agree to marry me, and then to jilt me. Young Sarah now came out from between the furniture, ready at last. She wore 2 orchids which I had sent to her. They, too, had been the brainstorm of Alexander Hamilton McCone. "You are so beautiful," I said, rising rapidly from my folding chair. It was true, for she was tall and slender and golden-haired and blue-eyed. Her skin was like satin. Her teeth were like pearls. But she radiated about as much sexuality as her grandmother's card table. This would continue to be the case for the next 7 years. Sarah Wyatt believed that sex was a sort of pratfall that was easily avoided.
"You do look nice, my dear," said Mrs. Sutton to Sarah. I feel so silly," said Sarah. "You don't believe you're beautiful?" said her grandmother. "Beautiful is such a funny thing to be," said Sarah. "Everybody says, 'Beautiful, beautiful, beautiful,' and you start wondering what it is and what's so wonderful about it." She laughed. "It's so dumb." "You should stop saying everything is silly and dumb," said her grandmother. "You will learn differently as you grow older. I think everybody older just pretends to know what's going on, and it's all so serious and wonderful," said Sarah. "Maybe if people didn't get so serious when they got older, we wouldn't have a depression now." "There's nothing constructive in laughing all the time," said her grandmother. "I can cry, too," said Sarah. "You want me to cry?" "No," said her grandmother. "You just go out with this nice young man and have a lovely time." "I can't laugh about those poor women who painted the clocks," said Sarah. "That's one thing I can't laugh about." "Nobody wants you to," said her grandmother. "You run along now."
Sarah was referring to an industrial tragedy that was notorious at the time. Sarah's family was in the middle of it and sick about it. The tragedy began in the family's clock company, the Wyatt Clock Company, one of the oldest companies in the United States, in Brockton, Massachusetts. It went like this. In the 1920s, the United States Navy awarded Wyatt Clock a contract to produce several thousand standardized ship's clocks that could be easily read in the dark. The dials were to be black. The hands and the numerals were to be hand-painted with white paint containing the radioactive element radium. About 100 Brockton women, most of them relatives of regular Wyatt Clock Company employees, were hired to paint the hands and numerals. Now all those women had died, or were about to die most horribly, with their bones crumbling, with their heads rotting off. The cause was radium poisoning. Every one of them had been told by a foreman, it had since come out in court, that she should keep a fine point on her brush by moistening it and shaping it with her lips from time to time. And as luck would have it, the daughter of one of those unfortunate women would become one of the 4 women I have ever loved in this vale of tears, along with my mother, my wife, and Sarah Wyatt. Mary Kathleen O'Looney was her name. So there I was in 1931, sashaying into the wedding cake lobby of the Hotel Arapahoe with beautiful Sarah Wyatt on my arm. At that point in time, Sarah Wyatt did not know that I was acting with all possible humorlessness on orders from Alexander Hamilton McCone. She would tell me later that she thought I was being witty when I said we should get all dressed up. We would laugh and laugh, she hoped. We would be people in a movie. Not at all. I was a robot programmed to behave like a genuine aristocrat. Oh, to be young again. Mr. McCone had told me to order the meal in advance. The owner himself received us. The room could seat at least 100, I would guess, but there were only a dozen other patrons there. Somehow they still had cash. There was a puffy old woman, I remember, eating alone and wearing a diamond necklace. She had a Pekingese dog in her lap. The dog had a diamond necklace, too.
"This must be a very expensive place," said Sarah.
Don't worry about it," I said.
"Money is so strange. The people who've got it and the people who don't," she mused. "I don't think anybody understands what's really going on."
"Some people must," I said. I no longer believe that.
"Does Mr. McCone know how much longer the Depression will last?" she asked.
"He doesn't know anything about business," I said.
"How can he still be so rich if he doesn't know anything about business?" she said.
"His brother runs everything," I said.
"I wish my father had somebody to run everything for him," she said.
I knew that things were going so badly for her father that her brother, my roommate, had decided to drop out of school at the end of the semester.
"It's so awful to see my father so low all the time," said Sarah. "If only people wouldn't care so much about money. I keep telling Father that I don't care about it. He just won't believe me. 'I've let you down. I've let everybody down,' he says."
Her father, incidentally, was an inactive partner in the Wyatt Clock Company. This did not limit his liability in the radium poisoning case, but his principal activity in the good old days had been as the largest yacht broker in Massachusetts. That business was utterly shot in 1931, of course. Sarah said she was sorry to be so depressing, that she knew we were supposed to have fun. It was then that the gypsy violinist came to our table. He played with all possible hypocrisy and brilliance in the frenzied expectation of a tip. I remembered that Mr. McCone had told me to tip lavishly, so I got out my billfold, and I took from it what I thought was a $1 bill. A common laborer in those days would have worked 10 hours for $1. The trouble was this. It wasn't a $1 bill. It was a $20 bill. Now the music stopped. I smiled my thanks. Diamond Jim Brady, reincarnated as the demented son of a Cleveland chauffeur, handed the gypsy a $20 bill. The gypsy was quite suave at first, imagining that he'd received $1. Sarah, believing it to be $1, too, thought I'd tipped too much.
"Good God," she said.
But then the gypsy unfolded the wad so that its astronomical denomination became apparent to all of us for the first time. He was as aghast as we were. And then, being a gypsy and hence 1 microsecond more cunning about money than we were, he darted out of the restaurant and into the night. But imagine the effect on Sarah. She thought I'd done it on purpose, that I was stupid enough to imagine that this would be a highly erotic event for her. Never have I been loathed so much.
"You inconceivable twerp," she said. "You unbelievable jerk. Who do you think I am that I would think what you just did was glamorous? Kindly take me home."
We left without eating, but not without paying. I could not help myself. I cried all the way home. I told her brokenly in the taxicab that nothing about the evening had been my own idea, that I was a robot invented and controlled by Alexander Hamilton McCone. I confessed to being half Polish and half Lithuanian and nothing but a chauffeur's son who had been ordered to put on clothing and airs of a gentleman. I said I wasn't going back to Harvard and that I wasn't even sure I wanted to live any more. I was so pitiful and Sarah was so contrite and interested that we became the closest of friends, as I say, off and on, for 7 years. She would drop out of Pine Manor. She would become a nurse. While in nurse's training, she would become so upset by the sickening and dying of the poor that she would join the Communist Party. She would make me join, too. So I might never have become a communist if Alexander Hamilton McCone had not insisted that I take a pretty girl to the Arapaho. And now, 45 years later, here I was, entering the lobby of the Arapaho again. Why had I chosen to spend my first nights of freedom there? For the irony of it. No American is so old and poor and friendless that he cannot make a collection of some of the most exquisite little ironies in town. What would the next day hold for me? I would, among other things, meet Leland Clues. But first, I would unpack my few possessions, put them away nicely, read a little while, and then get my beauty sleep. 2 top drawers in the dresser easily accepted all I owned, but I looked into all the other drawers anyway. Thus I discovered that the bottom drawer contained 7 incomplete clarinets, without cases or mouthpieces or bells. Life is like that sometimes. They were, of course, stolen. As I would learn the next day, they had been taken from a truck hijacked on the Ohio Turnpike, a robbery in which the driver had been killed. There were notices in every music store in the country, it turned out, saying that the police should be called immediately if a customer started talking about buying or selling sizable quantities of clarinet parts. But I simply closed the drawer again. I would say something in the morning. I was exhausted, I found, so I put myself to bed. Off I went, as my son used to say when he was little, to sleepy-by, which is to say, to sleep. At 6 o'clock on the following morning, which was the prison's time for rising, I walked out into a city stunned by its own innocence. Nobody was doing anything bad to anybody, anywhere. It was even hard to imagine badness. Why would anybody be bad? Down the block was the coffee shop of the Hotel Royalton, and I made for that. By the time I reached the coffee shop door, however, my self-confidence had collapsed. I believed that I was the ugliest, dirtiest little old bum in Manhattan. If I went into the coffee shop, everybody would be nauseated. But I somehow found the courage to go in anyway, and imagine my surprise. A waitress said to me, "Honey Bunch, you sit right down, and I'll bring you your coffee right away." I hadn't said anything to her, so I did sit down, and everywhere I looked I saw customers of every description being received with love. I had the feeling that if Frankenstein's monster crashed into the coffee shop through a brick wall, all anybody would say to him was, "You sit down here, lamb chop, and I'll bring you your coffee right away." The profit motive was not operating. The transactions were on the order of 68 cents, $1.10, $2.63. I would find out later that the man who ran the cash register was the owner, but he would not stay at his post to rake the money in. He wanted to cook and wait on people, too, so that the waitresses and cooks kept having to say to him, "That's my customer, Frank. Get back to the cash register." Or, "I'm the cook here, Frank. What's this mess you've started here? Get back to the cash register." His full name was Frank Ubriaco. He is now Executive Vice President of the McDonald's Hamburgers Division of the Ramjack Corporation. I could not help noticing that he had a withered right hand. I asked my waitress about it. She said he had literally French fried that hand about a year ago. He accidentally dropped his wristwatch into a vat of boiling cooking oil. Before he realized what he was doing, he plunged his hand into the oil trying to rescue the watch, which was a very expensive Bulova Accutron. So out into the city I went again, feeling much improved, and joined the throng of free enterprise charging along 42nd Street toward Fifth Avenue. According to plan, I began to study the faces coming at me, looking for a familiar one that might be of some use to me. I was prepared to be patient. When I got no farther than the curb at Fifth Avenue, though, my warning systems went off ear-splittingly. Beep, beep, honk, honk, roar! Positive identification had been made. Coming right at me was the husk of the man who had stolen Sarah Wyatt from me, the man I had ruined back in 1949. He had not seen me yet. He was Leland Clues. He had lost all his hair, and his feet were capsizing in broken shoes, and the cuffs of his trousers were frayed, and his right arm appeared to have died. Dangling at the end of it was a battered sample case. Clues had become an unsuccessful salesman, as I would find out later, of advertising matchbooks and calendars. He is nowadays, incidentally, a vice president in the diamond match division of the Ramjack Corporation. In spite of all that had happened to him, though, his face, as he came toward me, was illuminated as always with an adolescent, goofy goodwill. Now he saw me. The eye contact nearly electrocuted me. Clues was facing me. Plainly, he had not yet come up with a name for me. He pointed at me with his free hand, indicating that he knew I had figured in his life in some way, and then he made that finger twitch like a metronome, ticking off possible names for me. This was fun for him. As luck would have it, I had placed myself between a man wearing sandwich boards and a top hat and a little old woman who had no home, who carried all her possessions in shopping bags. She wore enormous purple and black basketball shoes. They were so out of scale with the rest of her that she looked like a kangaroo. When Leland Clues on the other side of Fifth Avenue realized who I was, he formed his mouth into a perfect O. Across the avenue he came, a happy, ramshackle scarecrow. I was bewildered by his happiness. What, I asked myself, can this wreck have to be so happy about? So there we were, reunited, with his shopping-bag lady looking on and listening. He put down his sample case, and he extended his right hand. He made a joke. "Walter F. Starbuck, I presume?" Did I harbor any bitterness against him for having stolen my girl so long ago? No. Sarah and I had loved each other, but we would never have been happy as man and wife. We could never have gotten a sex life going. I had never persuaded her to take sex seriously. Leland Clues had succeeded where I had failed, much to her grateful amazement, I'm sure. What tender memories did I have of Sarah? Much talk about human suffering and what could be done about it, and then infantile silliness for relief. We collected jokes for each other, to use when it was time for relief. We became addicted to talking to each other on the telephone for hours. Those talks were the most agreeable narcotic I have ever known. I was about to say to him gravely, watchfully, but sincerely, "How are you, Leland? It's good to see you again," but I never got to say it. The shopping-bag lady, whose voice was loud and piercing, cried,
"Oh, my God! Walter F. Starbuck, is that really you?"
I thought she was crazy. Now she began to lean her shopping bags against my legs as though I were a convenient fire plug. I tried to ignore her. I kept my gaze on the face of Leland Clues. "You're looking well," I said. "I'm feeling well," he said, "and so is Sarah, you'll be happy to know." "I'm glad to hear it," I said. Clues told me now that she was still doing a little nursing as a part-time thing. "I'm glad," I said. To my horror, I felt as though a sick bat had dropped from the eaves of a building and landed on my wrist. The shopping-bag lady had taken hold of me with her filthy little hand. "This is your wife?" he said. "My what?" I said. "I never saw her before in my life. Pretend she isn't here. This is crazy. I will not let her spoil this moment, which means a great deal to me."
"Oh, Walter, Walter, Walter," she said. "What has become of you? You're not the Walter F. Starbuck I knew."
"Oh, that's right," I said, "because you never knew any Walter F. Starbuck, but this man did." And I said to Clues, I suppose you know that I myself have spent time in prison now."
"Yes," he said. "Sarah and I were very sorry."
"I was let out only yesterday morning," I said.
"You have some trying days ahead," he said. "Is there somebody to look after you?"
"I'll look after you, Walter,"
said the shopping-bag lady. She leaned closer to me to say that so fervently, and I was nearly suffocated by her body odor and her awful breath. "Leland," I said, "all I want to say to you is that I know what jail is now, and God damn it, the thing I'm sorriest about in my whole life is that I had anything to do with sending you to jail."
"Well," he said, "Sarah and I have often talked about what we would like to say most to you."
"I'm sure," I said.
"And it's this. Thank you very much, Walter. My going to prison was the best thing that ever happened to Sarah and me. I'm not joking. Word of honor, it's true."
I was amazed. "But how can that be?"
"Because life is supposed to be a test," he said. "If my life had kept going the way it was going, I would have arrived in heaven, never having faced any problem that wasn't as easy as pie to solve. St. Peter would have had to say to me, 'You never lived, my boy. Who can say what you are?'"
"I see," I said.
"Sarah and I not only have love," he said, "but we have love that has stood up to the hardest tests."
"It sounds very beautiful," I said.
"We would be proud to have you see it," he said. "Could you come to supper sometime?"
"Oh, yes, I suppose," I said.
"Where are you staying?" he said.
"The Hotel Arapahoe."
"You'll hear from us," he said.
"I look forward to it," I said.
"As you'll see," he said, "we have nothing in the way of material wealth, but we need nothing in the way of material wealth."
"That's intelligent," I said.
"I'll say this, though," he said, "the food is good. As you may remember, Sarah is a wonderful cook."
"I remember," I said. And now the shopping-bag lady offered the first proof that she really did know a lot about me.
"You're talking about that Sarah Wyatt, aren't you?"
she said. There was a silence among us. Neither Clues nor I had mentioned Sarah's maiden name. I finally managed to ask her, woozy with shapeless misgivings, "How do you know that name?" She became foxy and coquettish.
"You think I don't know you were two-timing me with her the whole time?"
Given that much information, I no longer needed to guess who she was. I had slept with her during my senior year at Harvard, while still squiring the virginal Sarah Wyatt to parties and concerts and athletic events. She was one of the 4 women I had ever loved. She was the first woman with whom I had anything like a mature sexual experience. She was the remains of Mary Kathleen O'Looney.
"I was his circulation manager,"
said Mary Kathleen to Leland Clues very loudly.
"Wasn't I a good circulation manager, Walter?"
"Yes, you certainly were," I said. That was how we met. She presented herself at the tiny office of the Bay State Progressive in Cambridge at the start of my senior year, saying that she would do absolutely anything I told her to do as long as it would improve the condition of the working class. I made her circulation manager, put her in charge of handing out the paper at factory gates and along bread lines and so on. She'd been a scrawny little thing back then, but tough and cheerful and highly visible because of her bright red hair. She was such a hater of capitalism because her mother was one of the women who died of radium poisoning after working for the Wyatt Clock Company. Now what was left of Mary Kathleen bowed her head and responded modestly to my having agreed that she had been a good circulation manager.
"You'll be hearing from me soon," Clues said.
"I hope so," I said. He was gone. Mary Kathleen's shopping bags were still banked around my legs. She still held my wrist, and she would not lower her voice.
"Now that I've found you, Walter, I'll never let you go again. You used to tell me all the time how much you loved me, Walter, but then you went away, and I never heard from you again. Were you just lying to me?"
I may have made some responsive sound, blah, perhaps, or fluh.
"Look at me in the eye, Walter," she said.
Mary Kathleen and I were a miracle that our audience must have prayed for again and again. The rescue of at least one shopping bag lady by a man who knew her well. Some people were crying. I myself was about to cry. "Hug her," said a woman in the crowd. I did so. I found myself embracing a bundle of dry twigs that was wrapped in rags. That was when I myself began to cry. I was crying for the first time since I'd found my wife dead in bed one morning in my little brick bungalow in Chevy Chase, Maryland. Mary Kathleen now spoke very softly.
"God must have sent you."
There, I said. I went on hugging her.
"There's nobody I can trust any more."
Now, I said.
"Everybody's after me. They want to cut off my hands."
There, I said.
"I thought you were dead. I thought everybody was dead but me."
There.
"I still believe in the revolution, Walter."
I'm glad, I said.
"Everybody else lost heart. I never lost heart."
Good for you, I said.
"I've been working for the revolution every day," she said.
I'm sure.
"You'd be surprised," she said.
Get her a hot bath, said somebody in the crowd. Get some food in her, said somebody else.
"The revolution is coming, Walter. Sooner than you know," said Mary Kathleen.
I have a hotel room where you can rest a while, I said. I have a little money, not much, but some.
"Money?"
she said, and she laughed. Her scornful laughter about money had not changed. It was exactly as it had been 40 years before. Shall we go, I said. My room isn't far from here.
"I know a better place. Follow me, Walter," said Mary Kathleen.
I picked up 3 of her bags, and she picked up the other 3. Our ultimate destination, it would turn out, was the very top of the Chrysler Building, the quiet showroom of the American Harp Company up there. When we got to Grand Central Station, Mary Kathleen said that we had to make sure we weren't being followed. She led me up and down escalators, ramps, and stairways, looking over her shoulders for pursuers all the time. She brought us at last to an iron door at the end of a dimly lit corridor. We surely were all alone.
"This is our secret," she said.
Yes, I said. I had assumed that we were as deep in the station as anyone could go. How wrong I was. Mary Kathleen opened the iron door on an iron staircase going down, down, down. There was a secret world as vast as Carlsbad caverns below. It was used for nothing anymore. Down the steps we went. In conformance with fire laws, I suppose, there were light bulbs burning here and there, and there were little dishes of rat poison set around, but there were no other signs that anyone had been down there for years.
"This is my home, Walter," she said. "You wouldn't want me sleeping outdoors, would you? Be glad that I have such a nice and private home."
I am, I said.
"You not only talked to me, you hugged me," she said. "That's how I knew I could trust you. You're not after my hands."
No, I said.
"You know there are millions of poor souls out on the street looking for a toilet somebody will let them use," she said.
I suppose that's true, I said.
"Look at this," she said.
She led me into a chamber that contained a row of toilets.
"I'm putting my life in your hands telling you my secrets like this," she said.
I'm honored, I said. And then, out of the catacombs we climbed. She led me through a tunnel under Lexington Avenue and up a staircase into the lobby of the Chrysler Building. A guard shouted at us, but we got into the elevator before he could stop us. Mary Kathleen punched the button for the topmost floor, and upward we flew. Within a trice, the doors slithered open on a place of unearthly beauty and peace within the building's stainless steel crown. The vast floor at whose edge we stood was carpeted in grassy green. There was a fountain splashing at its center. There were garden benches and statues everywhere, and here and there a harp. As I have said, this was the showroom of the American Harp Company, which had recently become a subsidiary of the Ramjack Corporation. There was a Victorian gazebo near the elevator, which contained the desks of the salesman and his secretary. A woman was sobbing in there. What a morning it was for tears. The oldest man I had ever seen came tottering out of the gazebo. "Oh, it's you," he said to Mary Kathleen. She was accustomed to coming here almost every day and sitting for several hours. The understanding was that she was to get out of sight with her shopping bags in case a customer came in. There was a further understanding, which Mary Kathleen now had violated. "I thought I told you," he said to her, "that you were never to bring anybody else with you." Since I was carrying 3 shopping bags, he concluded that I was another derelict, a shopping bag man. I now made a blunder that would land me back in El Calabozo before noon on what was to have been my first full day of freedom. "As a matter of fact," I said, "I'm here on business. I was hoping you could advise me," I said, "as to where I could buy clarinet parts. Not whole clarinets, but just clarinet parts." I was not serious about this. I was extrapolating a business fantasy from the contents of my bottom drawer at the Arapahoe. The old man was secretly electrified. Thumbtacked to the bulletin board in the gazebo was a circular that advised him to call the police in case anyone expressed interest in buying or selling clarinet parts. As he would tell me later, he'd stuck it up there months before like a lottery ticket bought in a moment of folly. He'd never expected to win. His name was Delmar Peel. Delmar was nice enough later on to make me a present of the circular, which I hung on my office wall at Ramjack. I became his superior in the Ramjack family, since American Harp was a subsidiary of my division. "I realize that you yourself don't handle clarinets," I said. "You've come to the right place all the same," he hastened to assure me. "I know everybody in this business. If you and Madam X would like to make yourselves comfortable, I would be glad to make some telephone calls." "You're too kind," I said. Delmar conducted us to a bench far from the gazebo, so we could not hear him call the police. He had us sit down. "Comfy?" he said. Yes, thank you," I said.
"What's the trouble with Doris?"
said Mary Kathleen. That was the name of the secretary who was crying in the gazebo. Her full name was Doris Cram. She was 87 years old. He told Mary Kathleen now that Doris wept because she had had a hard blow. She'd been notified on the previous afternoon that she was going to have to retire immediately, now that Ramjack had taken over. The retirement age for all employees everywhere, except for the supervisory personnel, was 65. The profit picture, the bottom line, was ridiculous. It is so ridiculous that I recently undertook an investigation of why Ramjack had ever acquired American Harp. I learned that it was in order to capture the incredible lease on the top of the Chrysler Building. The lease ran until the year 2031 at a rent of $200 a month. Our Padleen wanted to turn the place into a restaurant. That the company also owned a factory in Chicago with 65 employees was a mere detail. If it could not be made to show a substantial profit within a year or two, Ramjack would close it down. Peace. Mary Kathleen O'Looney was, of course, the legendary Mrs. Jack Graham, the majority stockholder in the Ramjack Corporation. She had her ink pad and pens and writing paper in her basketball shoes. Those shoes were her bank vaults. She would claim later that she had told me who she really was on the elevator. I could only reply, "If I had heard you say that, Mary Kathleen, I surely would have remembered it." If I had known who she really was, all her talk about people who wanted to cut off her hands would have made a lot more sense. Whoever got her hands could pickle them and throw away the rest of her and control the Ramjack Corporation with just her fingertips. No wonder she was on the run. But she felt safe in this place. So Mary Kathleen and I had a nice long talk there, among all the harps with the police on their way.
"After my husband died, Walter," she said, "I became so unhappy and lost that I turned to alcohol."
That husband would have been Jack Graham, the reclusive engineer who had founded the Ramjack Corporation. She told about going to a private sanitarium in Louisville, Kentucky, where she was given shock treatments.
"I had to make up a lot of memories," she went on, "just to fill up all the empty spaces. There had been a war, I knew, and I remembered how much you hated fascism. I saw you on a beach somewhere, dead."
"I've had the same dream myself," I said. "Many's the time, Mary Kathleen, that I've wished it were true."
"No, no, no," she protested. "Thank God you're still alive. Thank God there's somebody still alive who cares what happens to this country. I thought maybe I was the last one. We will remake this country, and then the world. I couldn't do it myself, Walter. I've just been hanging on for dear life. I can still see enough to write if I write big, but I can't read the stories in newspapers any more. My eyes. How can I make sensible plans," she said, "if I don't know what's going on?"
"Well, you can't," I said.
"How can you base a revolution on Lawrence Welk and Sesame Street and All in the Family?" she said.
All these shows were sponsored by Ramjack.
"It's all such crap. I find this magazine called People in Garbage Can," she said, "but it isn't about people. It's about crap. But now I have you," she said. "Oh, if only Kenneth Whistler were alive, too."
She might as well have said, "If only Donald Duck were alive, too." Kenneth Whistler was a labor organizer who had been my idol in the old days, but I felt nothing about him now, had not thought about him for years. Whistler would have been a bum, too, by now, I supposed, if he hadn't died in a Kentucky mine disaster in 1941. He had insisted on being a worker as well as a labor organizer, and would have found modern union officials with their soft pink palms intolerable.
"Well,"
said Mary Kathleen,
"at least there's still us, and now we can start to make our move. Or maybe it isn't worth it. Maybe people are just no good anymore," she said. "They all look so mean to me. They aren't like they were during the Depression. I don't see anybody being kind to anybody anymore. Nobody will even speak to me."
She was eager to know about individual acts of kindness toward me, to have it confirmed that Americans could still be good-hearted. So I was glad to tell her about my first 24 hours as a free man, starting with the kindnesses shown to me by Clyde Carter, the guard, and then by Dr. Robert Fender, the supply clerk. After that, of course, I was given a ride in a limousine by Cleveland Laws. I embroidered on the hospitality offered to me by the employees at the coffee shop of the Hotel Royalton on the following morning. I was not able to give her the name of the owner of the shop, but only the physical detail that set him apart from the populace.
"The saint with the French fried hand," she said wonderingly.
"Yes," I said, "and you yourself saw a man I thought was the worst enemy I had in the world. He was the tall, blue-eyed man with the sample case. You heard him say that he forgave me for everything I had done and that I should have supper with him soon."
"Tell me his name again," she said.
"Leland Clues," I said.
"Saint Leland Clues," she said reverently. "See how much you've helped me already? I never could have found out about all these good people for myself."
Then she performed a minor mnemonic miracle, repeating all the names in chronological order.
"Clyde Carter, Dr. Robert Fender, Cleveland Laws, the man with the French fried hand, and Leland Clues."
Mary Kathleen took off one of her basketball shoes. The shoe she took off was crammed with memorabilia. She was particularly eager for me to see a snapshot of what she called my 2 favorite men. It was a picture of my one-time idol, Kenneth Whistler, the Harvard-educated labor organizer, shaking hands with a small and goofy-looking college boy. The boy was myself. That was when the police finally came clumping in to get me.
"I'll rescue you, Walter," said Mary Kathleen. "Then we'll rescue the world together."
I hung that snapshot of Kenneth Whistler and myself, taken in the autumn of 1935, dead center in the Great Depression, on my office wall at Ramjack. It was taken by Mary Kathleen on the morning after we first heard Whistler speak. He had come all the way to Cambridge from Harlan County, Kentucky, where he was a miner and a union organizer, to address a rally for the local chapter of the International Brotherhood of Abrasives and Adhesives Workers. The union was run by communists then. It is run by gangsters now. Times change. Whistler spoke at night. On the afternoon before he spoke, I made love to Mary Kathleen O'Looney for the first time. It was mixed up in our young minds somehow with the prospect of hearing and perhaps even touching a genuine saint. How better to present ourselves to him, or to any holy person, I suppose, than as Adam and Eve, smelling strongly of apple juice.
"Do you love me, Walter?"
Mary Kathleen asked my bare backside. What could I reply but this? Of course I do. There was a knock on the door. I had told my co-editor at the Bay State Progressive where I could be found in case of emergency. "Who is it?" I said. There was a sound like a little gasoline engine on the other side of the door. It was Alexander Hamilton McCone, my mentor, who had decided to come to Cambridge unannounced to see what sort of life I was leading on his money. He sounded like a motor because of his stammer. He stammered because of the Cuyahoga Massacre in 1894. He was trying to say his own name. I opened the door and said to old Mr. McCone, who was in his early 60s then, "Come in, come in." He was repulsed by my costume, by the unmade bed, and by the picture of Karl Marx on the wall. Out he went again, slamming the door behind him. He was through with me. Thus did my childhood end at last. I had become a man. And it was as a man that I went that night with Mary Kathleen on my arm to hear Kenneth Whistler speak. But what a treacherous young man I was. I already knew that I would abandon Mary Kathleen at the end of the academic year. I would write her a few love letters and then fall silent after that. She was too low class. Whistler began his speech. He promised us that the time was at hand for workers to take over their factories and to run them for the benefit of mankind. Profits that now went to drones and corrupt politicians would go to those who worked, and to the old and the sick and the orphaned. All people who could work would work. And on and on. Mary Kathleen whispered in my ear, "You're going to be just like him, Walter." People who had heard Kenneth Whistler speak before begged him to tell again about leading the pickets outside Charlestown Prison when Sacco and Vanzetti were executed. And it seems strange to me now that I have to explain who Sacco and Vanzetti were. When I was a young man, I expected the story of Sacco and Vanzetti to be retold as often and as movingly, to be as irresistible as the story of Jesus Christ someday. Weren't modern people, if they were to marvel creatively at their own lifetimes, I thought, entitled to a passion like Sacco and Vanzetti's, which ended in an electric chair? As for the last days of Sacco and Vanzetti as a modern passion, as on Golgotha, 3 lower-class men were executed at the same time by a state. This time, though, not just one of the 3 was innocent. This time, 2 of the 3 were innocent. The guilty man was a notorious thief and killer named Celestino Medeiros, convicted of a separate crime. As the end drew near, he confessed to the murders for which Sacco and Vanzetti had been convicted too. Sacco and Vanzetti never killed anybody. They arrived in America from Italy not knowing each other in 1908. Sacco was 17, Vanzetti was 20. Sacco, who had been a shoemaker in Italy, found himself welcome in a shoe factory in Milford, Massachusetts. He worked 6 days a week, 10 hours each day. He also found time to speak out and give money and take part in demonstrations for workers on strike for better wages and more humane treatment at work. Vanzetti had no trade and so went from job to job, in restaurants, in a quarry, in a steel mill, in a rope factory. He was an ardent reader. That much he had in common with Harvard men. In 1916, he led a strike against the rope factory, which was the Plymouth Cordage Company in Plymouth, Massachusetts, now a subsidiary of Ramjack. He was blacklisted by places of work far and wide after that, and became a self-employed peddler of fish to survive. The Department of Justice drew up secret lists of foreigners who made no secret whatsoever about how unjust and self-deceiving and ignorant and greedy they thought so many of the leaders were in the so-called Promised Land. Sacco and Vanzetti were on the list. A printer named Andrea Salcedo, who was a friend of Vanzetti's, was also on the list. He was arrested in New York City by federal agents on unspecified charges and held incommunicado for 8 weeks. On May 3rd of 1920, Salcedo fell or jumped or was pushed out of the 14-story window of an office maintained by the Department of Justice. Sacco and Vanzetti organized a meeting that was to demand an investigation of the arrest and death of Salcedo. It was scheduled for May 9th in Brockton, Massachusetts. Sacco and Vanzetti were arrested for dangerous radical activities before the meeting could take place. Their crime was the possession of leaflets calling for the meeting. But then they were suddenly charged with 2 unsolved murders, too. Vanzetti, for good measure, was also charged with an attempted payroll robbery in Bridgewater, Massachusetts. He was tried and convicted. Was Vanzetti guilty of this lesser crime? Possibly so. But it did not matter much. Who said it did not matter much? The judge who tried the case said it did not matter much. He was Webster Thayer, a graduate of Dartmouth College and a descendant of many fine New England families. He told the jury, "This man, although he may not have actually committed the crime attributed to him, is nevertheless morally culpable because he is the enemy of our existing institutions. Word of honor." This was said by a judge in an American court of law. And then this same Judge Thayer got to try Sacco and the known criminal Vanzetti for murder. They were found guilty about 1 year after their arrest, in July of 1921, when I was 8 years old. Before Sacco and Vanzetti could be executed, huge crowds turned out in protest all over the world. The fish peddler and the shoemaker had become planetary celebrities. "Never in our full life," said Vanzetti, "could we hope to do such work for tolerance, for justice, for man's understanding of man as now we do by accident." The authorities were so proud of what they were about to do that they asked a committee composed of 3 of the wisest, most respected, most fair-minded, and impartial men within the boundaries of the state to say to the world whether or not justice was about to be done. The triumvirate declared at last that Sacco and Vanzetti should die. When the decision was rendered, my hero, Kenneth Whistler, was in charge of pickets before the Massachusetts State House in Boston. And Whistler kept his pickets before the State House for 10 more days until the night of the execution. Then he led them through the winding streets and across the bridge to Charlestown, where the prison was. Among his pickets were Edna St. Vincent Millay and John Dos Passos and Haywood Broun. And Kenneth Whistler had with him a heavy parcel. It was an enormous banner, long and narrow and rolled up tight. He had had it made that morning. The prison lights began their dimming. When they had dimmed 9 times, Whistler and a friend hurried to the funeral parlor where the bodies of Sacco and Vanzetti were to be displayed. The state had no further use for the bodies. They had become the property of relatives and friends again. Whistler told us that 2 pairs of sawhorses had been set up in the front room of the funeral parlor awaiting the coffins. Now Whistler and his friend unfurled their banner, and they nailed it to the wall over the sawhorses. On the banner were painted the words that the man who had sentenced Sacco and Vanzetti to death, Webster Thayer, had spoken to a friend soon after he passed the sentence. "Did you see what I did to those anarchist bastards the other day?" Sacco and Vanzetti never lost their dignity, never cracked up. Walter F. Starbuck finally did. I seemed to hold up quite well when I was arrested in the showroom of the American Harp Company. There was no one to question me at once. The police station was so busy that there wasn't even an ordinary cell for me. I was eventually taken to a padded cell in the basement. Thus began a test of my character that I failed. I thought about Mary Kathleen and all that she'd been through. I still did not know that she was Mrs. Jack Graham. Exercising her cosmic powers as Mrs. Jack Graham, Mary Kathleen had meanwhile telephoned Arpad Lean, the top man at Ramjack. She ordered him to find out what the police had done with me and to send the toughest lawyer in New York City to rescue me, no matter what the cost. Lean was to make me a Ramjack vice president after that. While she was at it, she said, she had a list of other good people who were to be rounded up and also made vice presidents. These were the people I had told her about, of course, the strangers who had been so nice to me. She also ordered him to tell Doris Cram, the old secretary at the American Harp Company, that she didn't have to retire, no matter how old she was. Yes, and there in my padded cell, I told myself a joke I had read in the Harvard Lampoon when a freshman. It had amazed me back then because it seemed so dirty. She. How dare you kiss me like that? He. I was just trying to find out who ate all the macaroons. So I had a good laugh about that there in solitary. But then I began to crack. I could not stop saying to myself, macaroons, macaroons, macaroons. I eventually collapsed. At 7 o'clock that night, the toughest attorney in New York entered the police station upstairs. When the key was turned in the lock, I was lying on my stomach like a dog in a kennel facing the door. Now the lawyer showed himself. It would not have surprised me if he had been a unicorn. He was, in fact, almost that fantastic. A man who, when only 26 years old, had been chief counsel of the Senate Permanent Investigating Committee, whose chairman was Senator Joseph R. McCarthy. Mr. Starbuck, he said, I am here to represent you, if you want me to. I have been retained on your behalf by the Ramjack Corporation. Roy M. Cohn is my name. What a miracle worker he was. I was out of the police station and into a waiting limousine before you could say habeas corpus. Cohn, having delivered me to the limousine, did not himself get in. He wished me well without shaking my hand and was gone. So there I was in a limousine again. Why not? Anything was possible in a dream. So why shouldn't the dream go on and have Leland Clues already sitting in the back of the limousine? This it did. What was going on, of course, was that the limousine was cruising around Manhattan, picking up people Mary Kathleen O'Looney had told Arpad Lean to hire as Ramjack vice presidents. Clues asked me if I understood what was going on. No, I said, this is just the dream of a jailbird. It's not supposed to make sense. A man in the front seat next to the chauffeur now turned his face to us. I knew him, too. He had been one of the lawyers who had escorted Virgil Greathouse into prison on the morning before. He was Arpad Lean's lawyer, too. Gentlemen, he said genially, you are about to be offered the opportunity of your lives. When did she see me? Said Clues. What was the wonderful thing she saw me do? Who? I said. Mrs. Jack Graham, said the lawyer. Sorry I asked, I said. So we came to a stop in front of a run-down apartment building on the Upper West Side. Out came Frank Ubriaco, the owner of the coffee shop. His French-fried hand was elegantly sheathed in a white glove. Clues pulled down a jump seat for him. I said hello to him. Who are you? He said. You served me breakfast this morning, I said. Clues introduced himself. I declined to do so, and we were delivered without further conversation to the penthouse dwelling of Arpad Lean. Lean himself came out into the foyer. Gentlemen, he said, you've all been noticed by Mrs. Jack Graham. She didn't tell me where or when. She said you were honest and kind. Hey, not me, said Ubriaco. You're free to question her judgment if you want, said Lean. I'm not. I have to offer you good jobs. I don't mind doing that, though, and I'll tell you why.
She never told me to do anything that didn't turn out to be in the best interest of the company. I used to say that I never wanted to work for anybody, but working for Mrs. Jack Graham has been the greatest privilege of my life. He meant it. He did not mind making us all vice presidents. Lean said he would talk to us one by one in his library. Mrs. Graham didn't tell me about your backgrounds, what your special interest might be, so you're just going to have to tell me about yourselves. He said for Ubriaco to come into the library first and asked the rest of us to wait in the living room. A telephone rang in the foyer. It was Clue's wife, Sarah, my old girlfriend, calling from their apartment. She had just come from a private nursing case, had found his note which said where he was and what he was doing there and how he could be reached by telephone. He told her that I was there, too, and she could not believe it. She asked to talk to me. "Hi," I said. "This is crazy," she said. "What are you doing there?" She asked how Clues and I had met. I told her. "Such a small world, Walter," she said. She asked me to come home with Clues for supper, and I said I would if I could, that I didn't know what was going to happen next. I asked her where she lived. It turned out that she and Clues lived in the basement of the same building where her grandmother used to live, in Tudor City. She asked me if I remembered her grandmother's apartment, all the old servants and furniture jammed into only 4 rooms. I said I did, and we laughed. I did not tell her that my son also lived somewhere in Tudor City. She said that it was good that we could still laugh despite all we'd been through. "At least we still have our sense of humor," she said. "Yes, at least that," I agreed. "Waiter," she said, "what's this fly doing in my soup?" "What?" I said. "What's this fly doing in my soup?" she persisted. And then it came back to me. This was the opening line in a daisy chain of jokes we used to tell each other on the telephone. I closed my eyes. I gave the answering line, and the telephone became a time machine for me. It allowed me to escape into the 4th dimension. "I believe that's the backstroke, madam," I said. "Waiter, there's also a needle in my soup." "I'm sorry, madam," I said. "That's a typographical error. That should have been a noodle." "I keep thinking it's Tuesday," she said. "It is Tuesday," I said. "That's what I keep thinking," she said. She, too, had reason to escape into the 4th dimension. As I would find out later, her patient had died that night. Sarah had liked her a lot. And imagine, if you will, the effect this conversation was having on Leland Clues, who was sitting right next to me. My eyes were closed, as I say, and I was in such an ecstasy of timelessness and placelessness that I might as well have been having sexual intercourse with his wife before his eyes. He forgave me, of course. He forgives everybody for everything. But he still had to be impressed by how lazily in love Sarah and I could still be on the telephone. "I'm thinking of going on a diet," said Sarah. "I know how you can lose 20 pounds of ugly fat right away," I said. "How?" she said. "Have your head cut off," I said. Clues could hear only my half of the conversation, of course, so he could only hear the premise or the snapper of a joke, but never both. Some of the lines were highly suggestive. I asked Sarah, I remember, if she smoked after intercourse. Clues never heard her reply, which was this: "I don't know. I never looked." It was at that point that Arpad Lean and Frank Ubriaco came back into the living room. I told Sarah that I had to hang up now, and I did hang up. Arpad Lean stared at me hard. I had heard women speak of men's undressing them mentally. Now I was finding out what that felt like. As things turned out, that was exactly what Lean was doing to me, imagining what I would look like with no clothes on. He was beginning to suspect that I was Mrs. Jack Graham, checking up on him while disguised as a man. I could not know that, of course, that he thought I might be Mrs. Graham, so his subsequent courting of me was as inexplicable as anything that had happened to me all day. He was ravenous for my approval of everything he did. He told me, and not Leland Clues, that he had just made Frank Ubriaco a vice president of the McDonald's Hamburgers division of Ramjack. I nodded. I thought that was nice. The nod was not enough for Lean. "I think it's a wonderful example of putting the right man in the right job," he said. "Don't you? That's what Ramjack is all about, don't you think?" The question was for me and nobody else, so I finally said, "Yes."
I had to go through the same thing after he had interviewed and hired Clues. Clues was made a vice president of the Diamond Match Division, presumably because he had been selling advertising matchbooks for so long. It was then my turn to go into the library with him.
"Last but not least," he said coyly.
"Sir," I said, "I don't know what's going on. If you're really offering jobs, all I want is a little one."
"I'm under orders to make you a vice president," he said. "Orders from a person I respect very much. I intend to obey."
"I want to be a bartender," I said. "I have a Doctor of Mixology degree."
"You also have a lovely high voice when you want to," he said.
"I think I had better go home now," I said. "I can walk. It isn't far from here." It was only about 40 blocks. I had no shoes, but I would get home somehow without them.
"What an actor you are," he said. "Everyone here tonight remembers having seen you, but they've never seen each other before. How would you explain that?"
"I have no job," I said. "I just got out of prison. I've been walking around town with nothing to do."
"Such a complicated story," he said. "I won't ask you what you were in prison for."
What he meant, of course, was that I, as Mrs. Graham disguised as a man, did not have to go on telling taller and taller tales unless it entertained me to do so.
"The prison was in Georgia, I take it," he said. "So that's how you know Clyde Carter and Cleveland Laws and Dr. Robert Fender."
Yes," I said. Now I started to be afraid. Why would this man, one of the most powerful corporate executives on the planet, bother to find out so much about a pathetic little jailbird like me?
"And Doris Cram," he said. "I'm sure you know her, too."
I was so relieved not to know her. I was innocent after all. No, I said. "I don't know Doris Cram."
"The lady you asked me not to retire from the American Harp Company," he said.
"I never asked you anything."
"A slip of the tongue," he said.
And then horror grew in me as I realized that I really did know Doris Cram. She was the old secretary who had been sobbing and cleaning out her desk at the harp showroom. He knew everything. Now I was remembering the harp showroom. I felt as though I had been there 1,000 years ago. Mary Kathleen O'Looney had been there. Arpad Lean, in his omniscience, would surely mention her next. And then the nightmare of the past hour suddenly revealed itself as having been logical all along. I knew something that Lean himself did not know, that probably nobody in the world but me knew. It had to be true. Mary Kathleen O'Looney and Mrs. Jack Graham were the same. It was then that Arpad Lean raised my hand to his lips and kissed it.
"Forgive me for penetrating your disguise, madam," he said, "but I assume you made it so easy to penetrate on purpose. Your secret is safe with me. I am honored at last to meet you face to face."
"What the hell do you think you're doing?" I demanded to know. "I'm no goddamn woman." Arpad Lean was speechless and white. When he tried to recover, he did not recover much. He was beyond apologizing, too shattered to exhibit charm or cleverness of any kind. He could only grope for where the truth might lie.
"But you know her," he said at last.
There was resignation in his voice, for he was acknowledging what was becoming clear to me, too, that I was more powerful than he was if I wanted to be. I confirmed this for him. "I know her well," I said. "She will do whatever I tell her, I'm sure." This last was gratuitous. It was vengeful.
"Well," he said, and there was a long pause, "speak well of me, if you can."
More than anything now, I wanted to rescue Mary Kathleen O'Looney from the ghastly life the dragons in her mind had forced her to lead. I knew where I could find her. "I wonder if you could tell me," I said to the broken Lean, "where I could find a pair of shoes to fit me at this time of night." His voice came to me as though from the place where I was going next, the great cavern under Grand Central Station.
"No problem," he said.
The next thing I knew, I, all alone, having made certain that no one was following me, was descending the iron staircase into the cavern. Every few steps I called ahead, comfortingly. "It's Walter, Mary Kathleen. It's Walter here." At the bottom of the steps I saw a spot of blood on the floor. There were many more farther on, and I don't mean to draw out the suspense here to no purpose to let you suppose that I would find Mary Kathleen with her hands cut off waving her bloody stumps at me. She had in fact been sideswiped by a checker cab on Vanderbilt Avenue and had refused medical attention, saying that she was fine, just fine. But she was far from fine. Her nose was broken, which was where the blood had come from. There were worse things wrong with her. I cannot name them. She had hidden herself in a toilet stall. There could be no doubt as to who was in there. Her basketball shoes were visible beneath the door. At least there was not a corpse in there. When I crooned my name and my harmlessness again, she unlatched the door and pulled it open. "Oh, you poor woman," I cried. "What happened to you?" She told me about being hit by a taxi. She had just mailed a letter to Lean, confirming all the orders she had given to him on the telephone. "I'll get an ambulance," I said.
"No, no," she said. Stay here. Stay here. I'm dying, Walter. Don't you dare leave me alone again."
"I'm going to save your life," I said.
"You've got to hear what I have to say first," she said.
"Can I make you more comfortable?" I said.
"I am comfortable," she said.
Her little head was supported in a corner of the stall and cushioned against the metal by a pillow of rags. "I know your secret," I said. I expected it to be a moment of high drama when I told her that I knew she was the majority stockholder in Ramjack. It was a fizzle, of course. She had told me that already, and I had failed to hear.
"Are you going deaf, Walter? On top of everything else, am I going to have to yell my last words?"
"No," I said, "but I don't want to listen to any more talk about last words. You're so rich, Mary Kathleen, you can take over a whole hospital if you want to, and make them make you well again."
"I hate this life," she said. "I've done everything I can to make it better for everybody, but there probably isn't that much anybody could do. I've had enough of trying. I want to go to sleep now. After I die, look in my left shoe, Walter. You will find my will in there. I leave the Ramjack Corporation to its rightful owners, the American people."
She smiled. It was harrowing to see such cosmic happiness expressed by gums and a rotten tooth or two. I thought she had died. She had not. "Mary Kathleen," I said.
"I'm not dead yet," she said.
"I really am going to get help now," I said.
"If you do, I'll die," she said. "I can promise that now. I can die when I want to now. I can pick the time."
"Nobody can do that," I said.
"Shopping bag ladies can," she said. "It's our special dispensation. We can't say when we will start dying, but once we do start, Walter, we can pick the exact time. Would you like me to die right now at the count of 10?
"Not now, not ever," I said.
"Then stay here," she said.
So I did. What else could I do?
"I want to thank you for hugging me," she said.
"Any time," I said.
"Once a day is enough," she said. "I've had my hug today."
"You were the first woman I ever really made love to," I said. "Do you remember that?"
"I remember the hugs," she said. "I remember you said you loved me. No man had ever said that to me before. My mother used to say it to me a lot before she died."
I was starting to cry again.
"I know you never meant it," she said.
I did, I protested. "Oh, my God, I did."
"It's all right," she said. "You couldn't help it that you were born without a heart. At least you tried to believe what the people with hearts believed, so you were a good man just the same."
She stopped breathing. She stopped blinking. She was dead. There was more. There's always more. It was 9 o'clock in the evening of my first full day of freedom. I still had 3 hours to go. I went upstairs and told a policeman that there was a dead shopping bag lady in the basement. His duties had made him cynical. He said to me, "So, what else is new?" So I stood by the body of my old friend in the basement until the ambulance attendants came. I gave the police Mary Kathleen's maiden name. I gave them my true name as well. I was not about to be cute with the police. Neither was I ready to have anyone learn yet that Mrs. Jack Graham was dead. The consequences of that announcement would surely be an avalanche of some kind. I was the only person on the planet who could set it off. I was not ready to set it off yet. This was not cunning on my part, as some people have said. It was my natural awe of an avalanche. I walked home to the Hotel Arapahoe. When I told the night clerk my name, he said that there was a package for me, and a message, too. The police had returned my shoes and had picked up the clarinet parts from my bureau. The message was from Arpad Lean. Lean wrote that the letter was from my eyes only. He said that in the midst of the confusion at his penthouse, he'd never gotten around to offering a specific job to me. He suggested that I would be happy in his old division, which was Down Home Records. It now included the New York Times and Universal Pictures and Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey and Dell Publishing, among other things. "If this is not your cup of tea," he wrote, "we'll find something it is. I'm absolutely thrilled to know that we will have an observer for Mrs. Graham among us. Please give her my warmest regards." On the following morning there was nothing in the papers about the death of Mary Kathleen. Why would there have been? Who cared? So I went to the morgue and I claimed her. It was easily done. I found a mortician only 1 block away. I had him pick up the body and embalm it and put it into a serviceable casket. There was no funeral. I did not even accompany it to the grave, which was a crypt in a great concrete honeycomb in Morristown, New Jersey. Each crypt had a tasteful little bronze door on which the tenant's name was engraved. Little did I dream that the man who did the engraving of the doors would be arrested for drunken driving about 2 years later and would comment on what an unusual name the arresting officer had. He had come across it only once before. O'Looney. Officer O'Looney would become curious as to how the woman was related to him. O'Looney, using the sparse documents at the cemetery, would trace Mary Kathleen back to the morgue in New York City. There he would get a set of her fingerprints. On the outside chance that she'd been arrested or had spent time in a mental institution, he would send the prints to the FBI. Thus would Ramjack be brought tumbling down. So I dallied too long, and now I must go to prison again, they say. My hijinks with Mary Kathleen's remains were not crimes in and of themselves. However, my actions were accessory to the commission of a Class E felony, unlawfully concealing a will. I had entombed the will itself in a safe deposit box of Manufacturers Hanover Trust Company, a division of Ramjack. I lived very high. I bought a duplex with a low-interest company loan. I cashed stock options for clothes and furniture. I became a fixture at the Metropolitan Opera and the New York City Ballet, coming and going by limousine. How well did I do at Ramjack? During my incumbency, my division, including subsidiaries under its control, both covert and overt, won 11 platinum records, 42 gold records, 22 Oscars, 11 National Book Awards, 2 American League pennants, 2 National League pennants, 2 World Series, and 53 Grammys, and we never failed to show a return on capital of less than 23%. Well, it is all being sold off now by the federal government, which has hired 20,000 new bureaucrats, half of them lawyers, to oversee the job. Many people assumed that Ramjack owned everything in the country. It was something of an anticlimax, then, to discover that it owned only 19% of it, not even 1/5. Still, Ramjack was enormous when compared with other conglomerates. There are plenty of dollars, it turns out, to buy all the goodies the federal government has to sell. There was a photograph on an inside page of the Daily News yesterday of a dock in Brooklyn. There was about an acre of bales that looked like cotton on the dock. These were actually bales of American currency from Saudi Arabia, cash on the barrelhead, so to speak, for the McDonald's Hamburgers division of Ramjack. Who is the lucky owner of all those bales? The people of the United States, according to the will of Mary Kathleen O'Looney. What, in my opinion, was wrong with Mary Kathleen's scheme for a peaceful economic revolution? For one thing, the federal government was wholly unprepared to operate all the business of Ramjack on behalf of the people. For another thing, most of those businesses, rigged only to make profits, were as indifferent to the needs of the people as, say, thunderstorms. Mary Kathleen might as well have left 1/5 of the weather to the people. The economy is a thoughtless weather system, and nothing more. Some joke on the people to give them such a thing. There was a supper party given in my honor last week, a going-away party, you might say. It celebrated the completion of my last full day at the office. The host and hostess were Leland Clues and his lovely wife, Sarah. They have not moved out of their basement apartment in Tudor City, nor has Sarah given up private nursing, although Leland is now pulling down about $100,000 a year at Ramjack. I'm something of a hero to certain people, which is a novelty. I single-handedly extended the life of Ramjack by 2 years and a little more. If I had not concealed the will of Mary Kathleen, those at the party would never have become vice presidents of Ramjack. Clyde Carter, my former guide in Georgia and now a vice president of the Chrysler Air Temp division of Ramjack, was there. Frank Ubriaca was there. There was a telegram to me from Dr. Robert Fender, still in prison in Georgia. This is all it said. Ting-a-ling. Ting-a-ling was like the Hawaiian aloha, which also means both hello and goodbye. Hello and goodbye. What else is there to say? Our language is much larger than it needs to be. Arpad Lean sent a spoken message through Sarah, which was meant for my ears alone. Good show. That could be taken a million different ways. He was no longer presiding over the dismemberment of Ramjack, incidentally. He had been hired away by American Telephone and Telegraph Company, which had just been bought by a new company in Monaco named Bibek. Nobody has been able to find out who or what Bibek is so far. Some people think it's the Russians. I was seated at the place of honor, to the right of my hostess, Sarah Clues, the nurse. Of the 4 women I ever loved, she was always the easiest one to talk to. That may be because I had never promised her anything, and so had never let her down. Oh, Lord, the things I used to promise my mother and my poor wife and poor Mary Kathleen. Cleveland Laws, the former Ramjack chauffeur, was there. He's a vice president of the Transico division now. There were presents, some silly, some not. It was time for me now at the party to respond to all the toasts that had been offered to me. I stood. I had not had a drop of alcohol. I am a recidivist, I said. I defined the word as describing a person who habitually relapsed into crime or antisocial behavior. A good word to know, said Leland Clues. There was laughter all around. Our lovely hostess has promised 2 more surprises before the evening is over, I said. These would turn out to be the trooping in of my son and the playing of a phonograph recording of part of my testimony before Congressman Richard M. Nixon of California and others so long ago. We had begun our feast with oysters, so I announced that oysters were not the aphrodisiacs many people imagined them to be. There were boos, and then Sarah Clues beat me to the punchline of that particular joke. Walter ate 12 of them the other night, she said, and only 4 of them worked. She had lost another patient the day before. There was laughter all around, and I was suddenly offended and depressed by how silly we were. The news, after all, could hardly have been worse. Foreigners and criminals and other endlessly greedy conglomerates were gobbling up Ramjack. Mary Kathleen's legacy to the people was being converted to mountains of rapidly deteriorating currency, which were being squandered in turn on a huge new bureaucracy and on legal fees and consultants' fees and on and on. What was left, it was said by the politicians, would help to pay the interest on the people's national debt and would buy them more of the highways and public buildings and advanced weaponry they so richly deserved. Also, I was about to go to jail again. So I elected to complain about our levity. You know what is finally going to kill this planet, I said?
"Cholesterol," said Frank Ubriaco. "A total lack of seriousness," I said. "Nobody gives a damn anymore about what's really going on, what's going to happen next, or how we ever got into such a mess in the first place." Frank Ubriaco took this to be a suggestion that we become even sillier if possible, so he began to make booping and beeping sounds. Others chimed in with their own beeps and boops. They were all imitating supposedly intelligent signals from outer space, which had been received by radio telescopes only the week before. They were the latest news sensation and had, in fact, driven the Ramjack story off the front pages. People were beeping and booping and laughing, not just at my party, but everywhere. So I gave up on saying anything serious. I told another joke and sat down. The party ended, as I say, with the arrival of my son. He was a shock, such a homely and unhealthy and unhappy-looking young man. He had shaken my hand with the correct wretchedness of a German general surrendering at Stalingrad, say. I was still a monster to him. He had been cajoled into coming against his better judgment by Sarah Clues. Too bad. The record changed nothing. The record was meant to honor me, to let people who might not know about it hear for themselves what an idealistic young man I had been. The part in which I accidentally betrayed Leland Clues as a former communist was on another record, I presume. It was not played. Only my very last sentences were of much interest to me. I had forgotten them. Congressman Nixon had asked me why, as the son of immigrants who had been treated so well by Americans, as a man who had been treated like a son and been sent to Harvard by an American capitalist, I had been so ungrateful to the American economic system. The answer I gave was not original. Nothing about me has ever been original. I repeated what my one-time hero, Kenneth Whistler, had said, in reply to the same general sort of question long, long ago. Whistler had been a witness at a trial of strikers accused of violence. The judge had become curious about him, and asked him why such a well-educated man from such a good family would so immerse himself in the working class. My stolen answer to Nixon was this: "Why? The Sermon on the Mount, sir." There was polite applause when the people at the end of the party realized that the phonograph record had ended.